I was a rural mail carrier for 35 years, and in the process of driving the same 100-mile route day after day, I just began to keep records, and 30 odd years ago I began talking about it on the radio.
I know whenever I take students on a walk, you can hear the song art that's going on out here with the hermit thrush, and you can also hear the mosquitoes buzzing in your ear. All that kind of stuff, though, gives you a feel for what the place is like, instead of just trying to look at individual pictures, maybe in some kind of book.
Primarily these days, most of the time I spend out in these ecosystems is as a researcher. But they're a prevalent landscape feature. They're beautiful, they're unique. You just look around and everywhere, there may not be many species out here, but what is out here is amazing.
As a woman landowner, I think it's a very, very special opportunity to own an ecosystem like this spruce swamp. But I know that it's not mine forever. And I'm just trying to do my best to preserve our heritage, our Minnesota heritage, as a landowner.
Every month there's orchids blooming in the bog, and I photograph the same ones year after year after year because they last such a short time. You know, if you don't get them when they're blooming, they could be gone with hot weather in 5 days. So I just can't wait to see all my orchid friends.
And it's kind of nice to get a cranberry at the bog because there's all these big humps with sphagnum moss on. You can fairly dry while you can sit on one of those things and pick cranberry. You feel like a king out there.
Right now we're in a bog, small bog, that's interfaced within the forest, and as it is in many places in Minnesota. So it's a good place to get your feet wet and get a little taste of what bogs are like at all times of year.
I do like to emphasize that we have the largest bog in the lower 48. And I mean, if you think about the fact that it extends over probably 4 counties, that's pretty amazing. Plus the whole northern area near the border of Canada is bogland, which is where I grew up. We're getting on board here in Minnesota. We're starting to recognize that this is an amazing place.
I think because of the uniqueness of the bog soils, that the evolutionary processes that have gone on with these plants over the eons have really had to deal with a stressful environment. A lot of water, acidic conditions, not a lot of nutrients, and because of that, they're very unique adaptations to being able to survive in this kind of stuff. And so often some of the plants that you find in here and animals were able to evolve in this kind of environment and survive, or something that's kind of nice to stroll through and respect and go, how do they do this? And just ask all those questions, because the questions are really going to come up, I think, in a bog.
When you just think about what it takes for a species to thrive out here, a tree like that that's only that thick in diameter is 30 years old. And that's extremely small for what you'd expect of an upland species where they have lots of nutrient availability. So it's a fascinating ecosystem from many different perspectives.
These filter water, they make it clean.
It collects water for us. It's a carbon sink. It houses very rare plants, and it protects animals that are part of Minnesota's great natural resource.
I think bog is just a great restorer of nature in its pure sense. The plants exude oxygen, which they take the old carbon dioxide out of there and give off oxygen, and shouldn't have any trouble breathing out in a bog. And there's just something about the vastness of it, to me, is always very impressive.
Most bogs, there are roughly 2 dozen, maybe 3 dozen different plants in bogs.
You know, the diversity isn't great here, but the diversity here is unique from other upland sites.
And that certainly makes it much easier to figure out what's what. A lot of them aren't very common. A lot of them are pretty special. And some of them you just have to be in absolutely the right spot at exactly the right time. And you'll find something that is just truly spectacular, just astonishing.
There's some very rare sundews in this bog that people come from Germany, Scotland, England, all over the world to see, because they're absolutely unique and you can't see them anywhere else.
I'm thinking of ram's head lady slippers, or grass pink orchids, or any of the dozens of rain orchids that come up. The white bog orchid, the tall bog orchid, the northern bog orchid. There's ever so many reasons to be in a bog. I had the great good fortune to be escorted into a bog by Bruce Carlson, who was a wonderful botanist, and we went into I guess technically it would be a swamp. I think we found 11 different species of orchids, including showy lady slippers so thick that we had to detour sometimes hundreds of feet to get around the patches. And there was also a flower in there called Western Jacob's Ladder, which, so far as is known, only grows in 6 places in the world. And that flower, though not spectacular in the way an orchid is spectacular, just the rarity of it was absolutely memorable. When you think about a plant that's only known in 6 places in the world, and you've seen that plant, that's pretty special. That's reason enough to go back, just in the hopes that you might find something like that again.
We now recognize the contribution that bogs make in terms of habitat, wonderful habitat for all kinds of creatures. We're so lucky to have, along with the great grays and the sandhill cranes, to have wolves and moose and lynx live in the bog. We used to have caribou.
You can still see the trails that the woodland caribou made in the big bogs north of Red Lake.
And the last caribou to go through here then at any regularity and making a path would have been 1918, 1920.
One of the things that we've really enjoyed, especially during winter, are the owls that come through. We really have enjoyed seeing some great gray owls, but we have some real great resident barred owls that live nearby.
I saw a pair of great grays mating in one of the bogs near my cabin, which was an amazing treat. I could stand right under the tree where they were flirting with each other because they were so intent on what they were doing that they didn't even notice me. So really, any time of the year is wonderful in the bogs.
The science of bogs and what bogs do, how they sequester carbon and how they transform water, and just the entire chemistry that is a bog is so amazing, you know, that to alter them is to do much more than you would ever suspect. It has a lasting effect.
This is like a sponge, these plants here and the peat moss and all that stuff really holds this so that it doesn't have, you know, create areas of flooding around in our towns. And as these get erased, unfortunately, we end up seeing much more flooding happening, and they really control that for us. We got to learn from nature and what nature does to make sure that we can maintain water flow and the other services that it provides.
For many years, the state of Minnesota thought about this area as a wasteland and kept trying to find uses for it, that money could be made out of this big bog because it covers a number of counties.
We can spend a lot of money on sewers, or we can have these natural systems continue to maintain them, have them embedded in our human landscapes. Well, so what service does it do for it? How does it pay us back? Well, that's how it pays us back. And if you sit down and think about it, you could probably come up with dollars and cents. It probably makes more dollars and cents than actually putting in another street.
I notice places where people run equipment through bogs, whether it's snowmobiles in the winter or four-wheelers where they can get through them. It always changes the bog permanently. You can see those marks left behind by those kinds of insults.
The biggest threat to bogs so far in the history of Minnesota being a state, of course, is habitat destruction. And we drained a lot of the big bog back in the 1916, 1918, trying to get farmers from Bohemia, basically, who were the last people to come to the state, and there was no land for them, and so the state tried to talk them into growing celery and potatoes on bog land.
And they're going to drain this land and have this beautiful farmland, and it didn't amount to diddly squat. It drained it back for 200 feet, and then it was just as boggy as it ever was. And you'd have to be out of your mind to try to plow that anyhow. It's all peat for many feet down in most instances.
And so you can, every mile or 2 miles, you can see a drainage area. And that did a lot of damage. All those attempted drain areas are still there. There is peat mining going on right now in the Big Bog, which is a shame. It's a Canadian company. They've got plenty of peat bogs up there. I don't know why they had to come to Minnesota. These people are mining the Big Bog for sphagnum moss, for plants. So if you garden, please do not use sphagnum moss. Use something else, because it's all coming from bogs, and they will tell you that it will regenerate the peat, but that's not true. When they take all that away, they destroy the habitat for all the plants. bogs are very slow growing, and it would take years and years and years for the bog to come back. So it's just not true when these companies say, oh, it'll come right back. I mean, we can see that because we can see where all the drainage was from the 1920s. It's still there.
I remember another time we were looking for corners out north of Effie. We were in a big bog area there. In fact, I even cut off a little tamarack there that was, an inch and a half. And I brought home a hunk of that thing, and I cut it into little cylinders, and you could, with a hand lens, you could count every ring on it. And that thing was 127 years old, and it was an inch and a half, and only 5 feet high, because you could look out over the top of all these darn trees.
How important they are and why people should respect them. I guess just for the plants that grow in them, just for the fact that that's where you find most of the orchids that grow in northern Minnesota. That's reason enough to enjoy the bogs and to protect them.
I'm writing essays about wild orchids and my adventures with them, and one of the things I keep coming across is that so many orchids that are endangered, critically endangered or extinct in other states are not in ours simply because the bulk of our wild orchids are up here in bog country, and they're preserved because people don't go into the bogs and bother them. And so lots of other states are really envious of us. They think there may be tens of thousands of some orchids which are practically nowhere else. So what are we doing if we let that go?
We're at the Marcel Experimental Forest. This is where a new ecosystem experiment is going to occur. It's going to be the largest climate change experiment ever attempted on the planet. It's happening in north central Minnesota, and a lot more construction is going to happen here over the next year. This is part of a joint endeavor between the Oak Ridge National Lab, based out of Tennessee, and the U.S. Forest Service, and it's all part of the basic research program of the Department of Energy. We hope to turn on the experiment in 2015 and then operate it for 10 years. It's going to be hopefully a showpiece for the importance of peatlands and bogs in particular in ecosystem research, how they relate to global change science. It's going to bring in hundreds of scientists. It's going to be a resource available for educators. I think it allows us to provide some vital information on how these type of ecosystems will respond under the expectation of warmer climates and higher CO2 concentrations, as well as do a lot of outreach.
I'm afraid global warming is also a threat certainly to moose. It's getting too hot for moose, and we're losing, our moose population is way down, and they live in bogs. This is their habitat.
These type of peatlands, these are northern peatlands. These peatlands cover 3% of the land surface area, but they contain 30% of the global store of soil carbon. And what happens here matters to the whole global climate cycle. Because if that storage of carbon in soils changes, if it's emitted as gases such as carbon dioxide and methane, that will have feedbacks on the entire planet. One of the key things we're trying to understand is if in a future where we expect warmer temperatures and higher concentrations of carbon dioxide, how will peatlands respond? Will the species be the same? Will the gas emissions be the same? Will they still retain water in the landscape? Will they dry out? And what are the feedbacks? So if we're in more severe drought conditions in the future, how does that affect what we need to survive as a species? So it's interesting to think about how fundamental these types of ecosystems are for storing carbon, because if it's not here and it's in the atmosphere, it represents the potential for vast changes to the natural environment and the lifestyles that we have.
Part of the reason why global warming is a threat to the whole bog, not just the moose, is because the trees are changing.
We had a couple of open winters and we had some droughts, and now my tamarack has eastern larch beetle in it, and we have some pockets of standing dead tamarack. It's change, and we're just really wondering about the future of our bog and hoping that we can slow climate change down.
In Minnesota, we're at the southern extent of the northern peatland zone. There's projections that the climate of Minnesota might look more like the climate of Iowa or the climate of Missouri in the future. So if we shift to that type of climate that's no longer conducive to the formation and the sustaining of peatlands, they may be lost in part or in widespread areas of these landscapes. Most of the organic matter and the carbon storage has occurred over the last 5,000 years. And any shifts away from that past climate, even if by a degree or two, let alone the much more drastic projections of future changes in air temperature, could change the viability of these ecosystems to exist and to thrive into the future.
Of course, every morning is delightful out here because you hear the song sparrows and the white-throated sparrows singing, and the hermit thrushes are singing out here. There are always some woodpeckers pounding away at the trees. It's quite a nice spot to be.
Yeah, so what you're hearing in the background is a hermit thrush that's using its syrinx to provide you with a very flute-like sound. So I don't know if we actually really know how they do it, but boy, it's beautiful, isn't it?
It's very easy to get lost in them. You develop a healthy respect for a bog. Actually, there's a part of me that loves getting lost. I'm not going to stop running from orchid to orchid when they're in bloom and then losing my way. I know I'm not. I'm not that kind of person.
I always love being in bogs early March when there's a crust on the snow, and I can go out with my snowshoes and walk through the bog like it's a sidewalk. To me, that just is very special.
So many folks around here have relationships with the landscape and the peatlands that are part of it. Because what happens in peatlands relates to the water chemistry of lakes. People who fish have a lot of interest in what happens in the watersheds and in the peatlands that feed water to them. So people know, they realize when things are going on. If a tree species in a bog isn't looking healthy in a particular year, people notice. When things are flowering, people notice.
The coolness of it, it's always cool in a bog.
If you put your hand into the bog, you'll find that the water is so cold, even on a 90-degree day, right under the surface of the bog.
They all seem to have a restful nature, and they're quiet.
One thing I've always been impressed with the bog is that it's so quiet out there. It seems to absorb noise.
I think they're very quiet. I think they really hold you close to the land. Some very special plants, some very special animals. They're very wonderful ecosystems. But it is the wildlife. It is a draw. Oh, there went a hummingbird. What was that doing back there? Okay, sorry, off camera.
I swat a mosquito or two?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.